point is that holding on to a binary notion as if there's a distinction between so-called normal and abnormal is absolutely a driver of relapse. It makes people more likely to believe that there's some abstinence violation effect. And then if they have one dose, then it's off to the races, and I might as well just go ahead with it.
Welcome. This is the Dr. Junkie Show. I'm Ben Boyce, your host, and today I have a revealing chat with Dr. Erik Fisher, author of the book The Urge: Our History of Addiction. And we get into a lot. We talk about harm reduction, safe use sites, medication-assisted treatment, the word addiction, both the history of the term and its current cultural conception, prescription heroin, decriminalization, different forms of addiction therapy, coerced treatment, concepts of recovery, and a lot more. Dr. Fisher is an addiction psychiatrist, bioethics scholar, and author of the book, which you'll hear us talk about a lot today. He's also an assistant professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia University. I've linked all of his stuff in the episode description, including his webpage, where you can learn a lot more about him and what he does. With that, I hope you enjoy Dr. Erik Fisher. The man with the fabulous beard. I'm well, how are you? I appreciate you taking the time to sit down. So, do you want to just start with a quick description of who you are, what you do, and...
Yeah, sure thing. Let me introduce myself about the book, because I think that's a good way into describing who I am and what I do. I recently wrote this book called The Urge: Our History of Addiction, which is an intellectual and cultural history of addiction from ancient times through the present, how different cultures make sense of addiction and drug problems and what they've done to try to cope with it. And the reason I cared in the first place is I was a physician and a researcher in early training, in my residency training, when I myself had to contend with my own alcohol and drug problems. And I had a pretty catastrophic crisis from stimulant-induced psychosis and alcohol problems, which wound me up in the hospital. And then I was in a supervised and monitored treatment program that's available to doctors in New York State, which had some pluses, some minuses. We could talk more about that. But the upshot was I encountered a lot of different ideas about what addiction was, a lot of ideology, a lot of people, especially in the rehab that I was sent to, who had like a very old school, ideologically driven, in my view, perspective on what they called the disease of addiction and how it was the same in everyone and how everyone had to ascribe to the same sort of problem formulation and treatment and all the rest. And I try to do what people say, which is to take what you need and leave the rest and just kind of go on with life, whatever. But then about like 2 or 3 years into my own recovery, I still had this nagging sense of like, what had actually gone wrong with me? What was the problem? I got curious about the addiction, the history of addiction. So the book is an attempt to synthesize the different parts, like the clinician, somebody who's actively seeing people in psychiatric and addiction practice, the research and scholarship, and then also just me as a person in recovery.
And incredibly well woven, all three together. So I want to really, if we can start on one of those, I think the pattern, the weaving together of the history of epidemics in our country is maybe a great place to start. So the book is called The Urge. What seems to make these books magic, and I think any author realizes somewhere along the way, if you're not writing about yourself in some form, it's not going to be as passionate as it is the second you start to put your blood on the page. And this is a beautiful book where you've managed to do some great research and present it in a applicable way, but also tell us a story about yourself that says, this is why I'm here. But all the way back from, I think you go back even before the 1400s, but you really pick up steam in the 1700s gin craze, the 1777 Revolutionary War, the 1830 Christian field temperance movement, the 1870s post-Civil War epidemic, and 2 or 3 more that lead up to this 2020s epidemic. And you point out some really interesting patterns that seem to just be lost over time. It's a habit in a lot of Western cultures to not notice that what's happening right now looks eerily familiar to what happened 40 years ago. Can you say a little bit about what those cycles have looked like, what the conception of drug use and addiction at those different times looked like, and what in the world made it a problem or an epidemic?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an important point just to realize that there are cycles, because in this epidemic and in prior epidemics, people have a tendency to treat the current situation like it's somehow special or unique. And today, I think it is special and unique in a terrible way. We've passed this milestone of well more than 100,000 overdose deaths a year. And there's plenty of other bad statistics that we could cite. And also, drug epidemics are nothing new. We've been having them for all of these years. And when people think and act like our current situation is somehow novel or unique, then it blinds us to some of the complex multi-level forces that have always been operative. So in other words, when there's this simplistic narrative that, oh, you know, the Sacklers were this bad family and they addicted the country, and so therefore all we need to do is wrap our hands around the current opioid epidemic by, I don't know what, by clamping down on opioids. We've seen how well that has worked. It misses out on all of the different forces that are always at play, because it's not always just a novel drug. Just to briefly say a little bit more about what are behind epidemics, we could say that there are at least three big buckets of factors that contribute to drug epidemics over time. One is the drug itself. If you have a relatively novel drug or a more potent formulation of a drug or a higher dosage is more readily available, then that does lead to waves of drug problems for sure. But it's never just only that. There's also at least two other things, one of which is social decay, social wounding, diseases of despair, the sort of more broadly situated problems in society. And then the third is the actual industry itself. And not just like the industry, like the Sacklers, as a couple of people went out and did bad things. And listen, let's be clear. They were criminally liable, and the evidence is quite clear that they did a lot of bad actions. But it's also the overall capitalistic system that conspires and
they were playing on a on a playing field that they didn't invent, is how I like to say it. Like, yes. I guess they kind of threw a few funny passes and they didn't get caught by the ref, but that game has been long ago put into motion.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Yeah, maybe they innovated in some powerful ways some of the old dirty tricks, but it's not like they made up the playbook.
Right now, this is probably easy to spot. I guess we're living through it, so maybe 5-10 years from now, people will start to look back and diagnose whether when you live through one of these eras of upheaval in the Western world, we're seeing, I mean, Roe versus Wade went away 2 days ago, and some really odd things that are causing people that thought they had anchors. COVID-19, the political division that the people you used to be able to call on when you were just feeling like shit, you don't get to call those people because the bridges are burned. We live in that time, and now we also live in the results of that time. When you can't turn to your people or to your job or to your friends, you turn to the bottle or the needle more often because it always works. I wonder if we'll note that when people live through those eras, they recognize that a little more for a short amount of time before we proceed to stop teaching it to our kids. It is interesting to be alive when we're watching it, and instead of having to say, so what was going on in all these 1700s and the 1830s? We all know it's right in front of us what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then it comes time to fix stuff. And one of the other points that seems to creep in a lot is these problems tend to get ignored, even if they're problems, especially somewhere like the United States, where the land of the free, which often means let that person die. It's none of my problem as long as they're not bugging me. But as soon as religious ideology seems to get pressed into these things, often for oddly capitalistic reasons that somebody's making some money on the backside, people suddenly start to get fired up about laws and punishment and cracking down. And it's not just religion. There's some other things that make what is already a division in most cultures that seems invisible to most people be applied to this new thing, whether it's drinking or a specific drug. Can you say a little bit about what your research showed about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Addiction sort of belongs to the medical field today, I would argue. And it's not always been the case. That the torch has been passed from social domain to social domain over time. And one funny thing that happened, for example, in the earlier period of the American Republic, is that around the time of the American Revolution, there were doctors who were very interested in habitual drunkenness as a medical issue. And they said, listen, it's not just the effects of the behavior, but the behavior itself can be something like an illness and deserves to be treated by the medical profession. And that was pretty strong for a period of time. But then theories and outlooks changed. And so the torch was passed in a way to religion in the United States. The United States matters not just because we're from the United States and that's our legacy, but also because the United States has tended to take a sort of vanguard position on developing and then promoting ideas about addiction, sometimes for good, a lot of times for bad.
Yeah, sometimes both.
It's sometimes both simultaneously. Sure, absolutely. And it's around like the 1810s, 1820s, the idea of what we would today call addiction, like habitual drunkenness or another type of problem, went out of fashion in medicine. People said this is not a disorder of the mind. It doesn't deserve to be treated by the medical profession. And then so the torch was picked up by religion. And so a lot of our cultural ideas, a lot of our folk psychology about addiction is actually kind of, simmered in the cauldron of the Second Great Awakening and massive evangelical Christian movements in the United States, which is part of the reason why some of the intellectual history of addiction is uniquely American, is because there's a uniquely American strand of Christian theology that is so individualistic, so much focus on proving your worth through works, so much focus on prosperity and outright monetary success as being somehow evidence of your worthiness and your godliness.
I grew up in it. Well, we can talk about it sometime if you want, because it's wild when you learn it as a kid and just take it as fact, because it doesn't sound bad, or it's not bad if you believe that, but it doesn't sound as weird as it sounds now when you hear somebody say it.
Oh, yeah, you totally take it for granted. I mean, that's your value system growing up. That was my value system growing up in basically upper middle class New Jersey suburbs.
That's why it works.
In the absence of any other moral code or system of values, then of course people will gravitate toward the prevailing cultural idea.
Yeah, but you do a great job of drawing in that not only has there been this racial connection and class connection, and the poor using is always been seen different as the rich, but in the middle of all this, and sometimes under the radar, I heard you talking in a previous podcast about something I've talked about. Safe use sites have existed forever. I spent time in Battle Creek, Michigan in the 90s at safe use sites that I sometimes helped run. They were just in what the government would call crack houses. There has always been, beneath the religion, beneath the racism, beneath the classism, beneath the prison system and the police officers arresting people, safe places where people can use. And it turns out there's actually a lot of data that shows, especially when they've been made somewhat legal so doctors can come out of the closet and explain, hey, this is what's going on. They tend to be these really productive experiments that get snuffed out. Can you say a little bit about what you found there?
Yeah, definitely. It's analogous to the devastating news of the repeal of Roe versus Wade. Actually, you can't ban abortions. You just can't. You can ban safe abortions, or you can make abortions less safe. Likewise, you can't ban drug use, and you can't eradicate safe consumption facilities or safe consumption sites. You can only push them underground, because as long as there's been drugs and drug use, people have banded together for community, for support, for safety, to watch out for each other. And there are many, many historical analogs. One that comes to mind is the so-called opium den. And den is a pejorative word that people attach to it. And then we see in Charles Dickens' Mystery of Edwin Drood, one of my favorite Dickens, unfinished, but also an amazing musical. It starts off with this choir master who's been, what's his name? Jaspers. So Jaspers winds up corrupted by opium. He's this upstanding British guy who you see crawling out of this hideous, terrible opium den. But the truth of the matter is, opium dens, if we want to use that word for them, were basically like social clubs. And like a lot of social clubs around that time, some were very nice and some were a little rowdier and rougher and less resourced. But that's, just one version of the way people have come together. And, listen, a bar is a safe consumption facility.
Right.
At least in the sense that if somebody's getting out of control and they're getting violent, then they'll be removed from the situation. So there's
And
some
if they
safety
overdose,
involved.
they don't like lay there
Right.
and get ignored or go to jail.
Yeah. Yeah. We think nothing of it. We think absolutely nothing of it. So safe consumption facilities, I think it's really interesting that they're so politicized, that they're as politicized as they are in comparison to even other harm reduction services. It's sort of a no-brainer to me. What do you do? How could this be harmful? These arguments that people make about so-called enabling use or encouraging use. I mean, probably better than I do because of your academic work. The evidence is so clear that they don't do anything to increase public disorder.
We live in a world, we see methadone and Suboxone and Vivitrol's not related, but put in the same category to some degree medically. You hear those terms, and most of us that know about opioid addiction don't go, oh Lord, clutch the pearls, we can't give those things to people. But you go back in time to some of the first, Narco is the name of the facility I believe you were talking about. Some of the first harm reduction safe use sites were playing with a new drug called methadone that often got the same pushback as you would have now. And we haven't yet drawn the distinction, most of my listeners know, but drawn a distinction between harm reduction safe use sites. And what I want to make sure we talk about today is why are we messing around with the half-ass bring your own heroin that you still buy on the street from a drug user. But I think we should take a road through that and maybe talk a little bit more about addiction first. Those first harm reduction sites were actually using drugs that people were in an uproar about that now we just take for granted. And the term that's always applied to methadone isn't just good treatment or it's pretty good. It's gold standard. It's just like the term everybody in the industry is trying to apply to convince you. We're not just saying it's one of many ways. It's the gold standard. Because when I'm detoxing from heroin and you tell me, don't worry, 2 weeks it'll get a little better and 2 months from now you'll be able to sleep again. Fuck you. A lot of the times we're like, I'm not interested. I'll see you whenever I am. If you can tell me, you might be, not as thrilled as you would be for a couple of days, and then life will just be normal and you can go do stuff. You might immediately get me to go into a treatment.
Yeah. The early treatment with methadone, I think, is so instructive because it wasn't anywhere near, at least procedurally, it wasn't anywhere near as punitively administered as it is now. When it first started out, and I have an excerpt about this up if people want to sample some of the work. It's posted on my website. You can just click through and I've got a link.
In the episode description, I'll link that too.
All right, great. But the early history of methadone was very holistic and very open-minded, and there was a lot of services provided along with the methadone. But then because certain people in governmental and regulatory agencies had particular ideas about the stigma associated with opioids in general, then they cracked down and turned it into this really harsh system of administration, which is just so frustrating because many of the negative associations that people have with the administration of methadone in the United States, and there are problems with the way it's administered, are the results of the restrictions and the results of the sort of stigmatized implementation of methadone rather than the methadone itself. So people completely confuse to the extent that there are any problems with methadone today, they completely confuse the source of it.
Yeah. So you've played a little bit with this idea of addiction, and let's talk about actually implementing methadone and maybe some other drugs into your primary care facility. But to understand why on earth you do that, we would probably want to understand what the hell is addiction then? Is it a disease? Is it not a disease? You don't really see it as cut and dried as a lot of people would. So can you say a little about that?
Yeah, we don't have a clinical definition of addiction, as far as I'm concerned, in the psychiatric profession. There's a diagnostic and statistical manual that classifies a whole bunch of mental disorders. One of them is substance use disorder. Substance use disorder doesn't really match up with our everyday casual discussion of addiction. Both my parents had addiction growing up. Both of them, by their own admission, had problems with alcohol. And both of them identified as alcoholics at various points in their lives. Today or any time since DSM-5, they would never walk around saying, oh, I have substance use disorder. That's just not the way we speak. The associations that we make with addiction are totally different than this big bucket that we call substance use disorder. Part of the reason for that, I think, is that addiction is a really complicated, old, multi-layered term. There's one writer, I didn't even get this into the book because I think my editor said it was a little too academic, but there's one scholar that called the word addiction a palimpsest, meaning it's the old kinds of papyrus where they would scribble out and then write in a new thing, and then scribble out and write in a new thing.
The Bible. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Or in monastic writing in the Middle Ages, because the vellum that they would use to write on was so precious. But then if you look closely in modern scholars, when they're trying to like tease apart the history of a writing, they can see layers of writing on top of each other. And addiction is almost like that, where there's a meaning from ancient Rome, and then there's also a meaning from when the Protestants brought it into the English language in the 1500s. And then there's also a set of meanings that have accumulated, like mixing metaphors here a little bit, like layers of sediment at a riverbed over and over and over again, to the point where like I think everybody's got a different idea about what addiction is. Yeah. And I have no interest. There's a million books you could run out there and get some asshole's definition of what addiction is.
Yep.
Like,
I'm one of those assholes. Yeah.
And it's totally fine. I think we need that. Like, we need a clinical definition of addiction. We need like a cultural definition of addiction. It's fine that multiple ones exist.
I mean, I kind of bought your argument that maybe that's not the case. So
I think it's like a raft that gets you to the other shore. Where enough. You know, different understandings of addiction serve different purposes at different points in time. Where, yeah, even today I identify as a person with addiction. That makes sense to me. Even though, as I write in the book, there's no hard and fast line between me and the rest of the population. I think everybody struggles with self-will problems. Everybody struggles with self-control. And nobody fits this perfect capitalistic neoliberal model of like a rational actor who's going through life that like doing what you're supposed to be doing. It just doesn't work that way.
And even if they did, they have like sort of some addictive tendencies built into that model. The capitalistic model's about pick your risk and then roll the dice. And if it works, you get that brain activity, whether it's a big old chunk of money or not. These different definitions and different venues are fine and they're helpful. I understand why that would be. When you're in an AMA meeting, if you just start inserting your own definition of addiction and trying to use it differently than them, they're all scratching their head. And if you're in front of your psychiatrist, you use whatever definition's there. If you're with your friends at the bar, it's different. But this is part of the problem that you get at when it comes to treatment. It's not integrated with our regular medical care. So if I say get a planner's wart on my finger, I have a primary care facility. I just go see my doctor I know. When I run out of Valium, it's time for a physical. When I get weird headaches, if I'm struggling with sleep, whatever it happens to go on, I don't have to track down, well, where would I go to sit in a room with the right group of people and figure out what definition to use, because my doctor can just treat me for most of those things. And if she can't, she can at least point me to another, probably somebody that can share files with her, that they can have open communication. My AA sponsor is probably not on the phone with my doctor sharing that stuff. So how do you see that moving forward if things go the way I think you were progressing for? And I think it looks like they are already going this way. My primary care facility has Suboxone treatment integrated now into the facility, as well as therapy at the same facility.
Great. That's great. And it's in the vast minority, unfortunately. We desperately need integrated care. There's no good rational reason why substance use disorder treatment is not integrated with the rest of psychiatric treatment, is not integrated with the rest of medical treatment. And even compared to other psychiatric issues, people with substance use disorders are vastly, vastly underserved. We have a long way to go there. I think one important thing to recognize is that's a historical accident. You know, it's not by design. It's not because people sat down and said, hey, let's build these funny things called rehabs out in the woods, and let's make that the common casual assumption for how people should get help for an addiction problem. And it's not, as some anti 12-step writers have implied, that there's some sort of cabal of bad actors who have somehow conspired to make 12-step the law of the land. It's
capitalism,
because
you don't have to conspire. It just happens.
It just happens.
Yeah.
But, you know, it happens also because the medical profession quite consciously abdicated its responsibility to take care of people with addiction back in the 1910s, 1920s.
Ooh.
That was in response to broader social and cultural currents. But I think we have to recognize that people in mid 20th century were filling a vacuum. And that's part of the reason why we have this weirdly divided system that we have today.
So speaking of cycles, you're talking about the 1920s. I'm hearing story after story of pain patients that are struggling, people that are going back to the streets. And that's what I feel like is happening right now, that abdication that's saying, sorry, the system is designed to say they might put us in jail. Same thing they're doing with Roe. They're being very clear about, oh, we're not going to arrest you, honey. We're just going to make sure that you can't find somebody to safely do this thing. It's called an abortion anywhere in the area. Are you seeing that same thing play out on your side of the divide?
Yeah, well, I don't treat pain with opioids because that's not a psychiatrist's job. So I don't have a front row seat to that in my clinical practice today, but I do see very well through reporting and discussions with colleagues outside of my immediate profession and specialty that there's a massive problem with the undertreatment of pain and rigid top-down ideas about pain and pain treatment and pain control, as if some sort of like numerical or quantitative limit on pain medications is somehow going to help the problem in any way. So I absolutely agree that we're abdicating, the medical profession is abdicating proper care of pain because of some stigmatized ideas about drugs, thinking that opioids somehow have all this power, that they magically essentially infect people and cause them to be addicted just totally on their own. That's pharmacological determinism. That's the idea. The actual phrase was coined in response to the crack epidemic in the 1980s, this notion that the drug holds all the power and certain drugs are uniquely powerful. Back then, there was a dopamine researcher who said, if I could choose between my daughter trying heroin or crack, I would choose heroin. And, like that's totally inconceivable now. But back then, the crack was deemed the magic drug, which, by the way, is only cocaine prepared in a different way. It's not any chemically or otherwise distinct other than the basic pharmacokinetic and dynamic changes. That stuff that you're talking about is just a reflection of this pharmacological determinism, this idea that drugs are magic, that drugs hold something powerful within them, that they are the agents doing the work, and that sets the stage for there to be good drugs and bad drugs. Like some drugs are okay drugs or safe drugs or white drugs implicitly or explicitly, and other drugs are bad drugs. Other drugs are dangerous and harmful and inherently quote unquote addictive. And that's a really, really harmful distinction. Every time we made that distinction in history, it's come back to bite us in the butt because, the drugs that are deemed safe wind up having a honeymoon period. People say, oh, hooray, stimulants. And then, through the 1930s, 1940s, massive stimulant use. And then, hey, guess what? We have a problem with stimulants, so forth and so on. This cycle turns over and over again.
Yeah, and if I remember it, you cite a couple studies that show when we look really hard for predictors of relapse in people, the closest thing we can find, or the biggest predictor of relapse, is a belief in what we're talking about, which should kind of boggle our minds. But belief that addiction is a disease is actually a predictor that you're going to relapse if I don't believe that and you do. Let me jump
in there because I think it's not necessarily that it's bigger or smaller. I don't know that we can make that claim. The finding is that a belief in a binary disease model, that some people over here have a problem and the rest are quote unquote normal, that does increase the probability of relapse. Like, I don't know if that's a bigger probability of relapse than, say, for example, being forcibly tapered off of Suboxone. That's probably a bigger driver of relapse than
that's a really good point.
Some idea somebody has. The point is that holding on to a binary notion as if there's a distinction between so-called normal and abnormal is absolutely a driver of relapse. It makes people more likely to believe that there's some abstinence violation effect, and then if they have one dose, then it's off to the races, and I might as well just go ahead with it.
We live in the train spotting culture where most of us, that's about all we knew about detox growing up, is like, it's so terrible, your skin's falling off. And I think those images stick. And even if when you get there, you find, oh, it wasn't quite that bad. I've got friends right now, too, that just decided to detox themselves from kratom and from pretty big doses, like one of them 30 grams a day sometimes. And it wasn't what all the websites said. They were kind of like, there's a lot of people online that are just like, it's so bad. And they both are sleeping like babies. Now they had to, decrease their doses. But now that they've got that message, they find that not only are they not day after day struggling with this, I can't use anything at all, but that lack of anxiety about the struggle, that it's yes or no, fight it all the way. They don't have as many urges to use it in the first place. It's a weird thing that happens when you get yourself into a holistic perspective, which is really what we're talking about. Addiction would suddenly be it might be a term doctors use, but addiction isn't just like everything's going swell. I'm in a vacuum that has the same history as everyone else, and then today I just decide to become addicted to heroin. It's all the other stuff in the background that when you medicate somebody, those things don't go away. You just kind of make it easier to work on them. So hopefully we're working on them.
Yeah, people have a lot of ideas about the so-called physical drivers of addiction, the way that the addiction is supposedly physically determined, as opposed to, say, mentally or socially. And I think those physical stories have been particularly strong at various points in time. The ideas about being essentially fated to develop addiction because of genetics, or certain drugs being physically versus psychologically addiction. And really, that's often a way, I think, of privileging a overly reductionistic view of addiction, to say that, again, that the drugs hold all the power, and that, you know, if it's a drug that causes the addiction, then stopping the drug should throw you into some sort of terrible, awful, massive withdrawal. It's much more psychologically healthy to have an open, curious, experimental attitude. Like it sounds like you're describing in your friends, like, let's see what happens. Some people say that discontinuing this medication or this drug is difficult. Let's see what it's like for me. And then that opens the door, even in a psychotherapeutic sense, it opens the door to more of a present focused awareness, and going with curiosity into whatever is arising. Because in that acceptance, then you have the actual opportunity to meet the present moment fully, but then also to ground yourself in the present moment so you can actually take effective action. That's often missed when people attach to some sort of idea or narrative about the way drugs work.
Like an addictive personality or genetics. Could you say a little bit more about what you found with genetics? Specifically, I found this is one that gets reduced, and people want to hear it either is or it isn't. And it's not necessarily that easy. It's what almost sounds like a secondhand effect or a secondary effect. I think the numbers you used, they're in front of me, 25 to 70% of addiction is genetic related, or something along that lines is how you worded it. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a wide range. So what does it mean? It means that today in 2022, our statistics they have a degree of spread to them, but those numbers come down to saying roughly 50% of the variance in the development of addiction is explained by genetics. And that means that roughly 50% is explained by everything else. And everything else is really important too. And that's important to me because I heard directly in clinical practice, when I was talking to patients, people resort to genetic explanations for their behavior. People would say to me, well, I was guaranteed to relapse because it's genetic, right? That means that I'm going to use again. That means that I couldn't have done otherwise. And I think that sort of overly reductionistic perspective is really harmful. It takes away people's agency and choice. And, not incidentally, that sort of overly reductionistic perspective on genetics was actively encouraged by for-profit treatment centers throughout the 1980s. And I think any researcher or clinician around that time would have said, analogous to the disease discussion, by the way, any reasonable clinician or researcher would have said, oh yeah, it's a mix of biological, psychological, and social. Fine. But in the popular understanding, or when somebody is suffering and then they wind up at a rehab and they're being told a pitch for why they need to come in because the rehab is the only one that has the secret key that unlocks their recovery, our explanations are not so nuanced, and it can become oversimplified. And then, that's how we wound up by the 1990s with certain newspapers running front page articles about finding a gene for addiction.
Yeah.
And then it all reduces to genetics in the popular imagination. That's a big problem.
And the commercials that we had, I think they got sued, so I haven't heard them in 4 or 5 years, but that come in and see us twice and we'll give you a couple pills and you won't want to drink ever again, or you'll be able to control drink from there on out. There's always been these magic things. So we just sort of moved gears into recovery, which is great. Before we dive too deep into it, what is it that got you to go to I know this is a tricky question for you because I've read the book, but what is it that made you either go or follow through? Because it seems like it was like all of us. It's more than a decision where sometimes we get a foot in our ass and have to go. It's also deciding I'm going to stay here.
Well, I had a crisis. I mentioned before I had this psychotic episode induced by stimulants and also by alcohol and alcohol withdrawal. So initially I was just brought to the hospital. But then once I was in the hospital, I did have a choice. I had the choice of sticking with it and coming to terms with the enormity of the problem that I was struggling with, or going out and trying to do it again my own way. And my resolve wavered. I wasn't solid. There were initial days where I said, I think I'm an alcoholic like my parents. Please help me. Tell me what to do. And then just a few days later, I would say, I changed my mind. I'm going to try a different way. So in my case, I was very lucky, I think, from my present perspective, to have had some degree of pressure from the fact that I was a doctor. And if I weren't safe, then I would have to be reported to the medical board. At the time, I thought it was the worst thing in the world. At the time, I thought my life was over. I thought, this is terrible. This is an infringement of my liberty. This is some sort of weird quasi judicial thing that nobody even knows about. It's violating my rights. I should be able to change my mind. At first I told you people I did want to participate in your program, but now I don't. And so why shouldn't I just be able to go do an intensive outpatient program rather than this? And so and then the next day I would think to myself, oh, maybe I shouldn't trust myself, so forth and so on. Some of my resistance was exacerbated by some of the confrontational practices I saw. When I got to rehab and I saw some people, not everyone, but when I saw some people being really tough and saying your best thinking brought you here and you have to take the cotton out of your mouth, out of your ears and put it in your mouth, that made me think this is nonsense. This is not not helpful. But the bottom line is that coercion in the sense of a hard choice was really helpful to me. Looking back,
that was hard to read, by the way. I wanted to be like, no.
Yeah.
But I think you worded it just like there's something just like that. Like I started to realize, fine, I'm glad I've been forced to go here.
I don't know what would have happened if I were allowed to have more latitude and liberty. Maybe I would have been fine. Maybe it would have been better. Who knows? I do not know the answer to that, but I think I wouldn't gamble on it. If my present self were in charge of the situation that my 29-year-old self were through, and we're not talking about a long time, we're talking about 12 years here, I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't take that gamble. It's not worth it to me today. Just in the same way that like today, it's not worth it for me. It doesn't matter to me to like run the experiment of going out and drinking just to see. That really mattered to me when I was 27, 28, 29. It really mattered to me to show to myself and to show to other people, I'm the type of person who can drink moderately. I want to be able to go out and party. I want to be able to stay up late and have a good time. What I said was a good time. And now that identity doesn't matter as much to me.
I have identity bolded as something I wanted to make sure we talk about, because this is something else that purpose of writing the book, like I said earlier, seems to be in this whole project. It sounds like much like me. I started in psychology in my undergrad because I wanted to figure out what the hell was wrong with me. And I ended up in criminal justice communication and the war on drugs because I spent time in prison for being an addicted person. And all of this was like, well, if I'm going to go to college, I better start with this guy. And in the end, this is most people's experience. You realize, oh crap, there's way more I don't know than I do. And I just spent 12 years learning. So here's what I got. It's a process in motion, but identity is a big part of this. You're in treatment and you at least are seeing in yourself, okay, this identity, I mean, what you're saying in our culture, it's cool to be the drug user. It's cool to be the drinker, not the one that's out of control, but the cool guy who can put a few down and you're watching the game or whatever. That's a decent identity. It's not Superman. It's not millionaire, rock star, or whatever else people. But when you're a kid, as we move through that, if you go to treatment and you have on the backside of that nothing, as many of the people that I've met in treatments do, they feel like, well, I've spent 10 years now just doing this and not really doing a lot else except menial stuff to pay the bills or whatever. Who the hell am I if not this? You had an identity that I started to build shortly after I got out of prison that gets left out of these conversations a lot. People don't really think about that when we talk about, from a public policy perspective, what should we do about addiction and overdose and all the, we think jail or some sort of treatment and that's the end of it. And identity is really important. Having something that you can get up in the morning and instead of getting to work drinking, it makes you feel like, hey, I'm doing something today. I'm kind of happy with what's going on. I just sort of said it all for you, but you have thoughts on that?
No, I think that's a good encapsulation of some of the most important themes. Addiction and drug problems in general are not just some sort of physical response, and they're not even some sort of learning process necessarily, not in the sense of classical conditioning, strict behaviorism, psychology. It also has to do with ideas about the self. And for me, my view of myself got in my way, my view of who I was supposed to be, and my view of what my relationship to drugs and alcohol was supposed to be really was harmful. And that's a place where values and morals come into play in addiction. Not in the sense that people who use drugs or people who have addiction problems are immoral or they're bad people or they're there because they made bad choices or it's their own fault. You can certainly find all those ideas. I'm saying something I think a lot trickier to articulate, but really important to recognize, is that part of my addiction was my misalignment with my life purpose and my values and beliefs. And in part because I didn't have a workable model for what my life was about or what was meaningful to me. Then the sort of like hedonic pursuit of drugs and alcohol and the stuff that I associated with it became a guiding value in my life. And that's a problem. And then, again, it's not that I had bad values. It's that over time, we can shape our relationship to our values. We can clarify our values and be intentional about our values. And for me, thinking through, because I don't think that was my like quote unquote real self, like thinking through like what truly matters to me in my heart of hearts, it was a really important part of me finding recovery from addiction too.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that word recovery, but maybe it's worth finishing up the treatment section of this conversation by just asking, where should we move? You're a psychiatrist. Would it be helpful if we worked on making it possible to write prescriptions for things like long-term methadone maintenance treatments through psychiatry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's an easy one, honestly, that we need to much better expand and liberalize the opportunities for people to get on medications for addiction treatment. And we need the full complement. You know, you said the gold standard are agonists like methadone and buprenorphine. That's absolutely true. They have the strongest evidence for reducing overdose deaths. And some people won't take them. And some people will try them, and for whatever reason, they don't work for them. And, you know, the other people, maybe they are still struggling with like ideology within their family or whatever. So we need the full complement of both present and future treatment options on the table. And there's already some work along those lines. You know, there's some interest in relaxing some of the take-home restrictions on methadone. It's just like one of the small examples in policy. There are some things that happen because of COVID, but I think people are now, they have the opportunity to do research on some of these practices and establish that, yes, they do help people without causing any sort of significant harm. But I think, you know, bottom line is there's always been a lot of policy responses that would save lives. That was true in the 80s. That was true in the 60s. We've always had some amount of evidence, or at least like professional wisdom about what would save lives if we could just wave a magic wand and do it tomorrow. In a way, the more interesting cultural question for me is, why aren't we doing it? You know, even compared to other developed countries, that's part of the reason I'm interested in Portugal and Western Europe, is why is it so hard in the United States to implement?
You answer that though. So the question would be, and it should have been far higher up, but you actually explain this better than, or simpler anyway, than I think I've ever heard it explained. Why on earth would alcohol companies be pro-alcohol stigma?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's much the same answer as, why would pharmaceutical companies be so willing to lobby to keep drug laws strict, or to donate to DARE campaigns, which we've noticed in the past too, or tobacco and alcohol, to donate to those same campaigns. And it turns out that stigma actually isn't just a direct alcohol bad. It tends to be alcohol bad for that group, and that group, because most of us like to drink at least somewhat, or we know somebody that does, or, you know, we have a nostalgic memory of a granddad who seemed to be just fine, and he had a bottle of bourbon he'd drink now and then. There has been a history of the legal drug manufacturers figuring out how to maneuver in our society. And at this point, I don't know what else it could be. I mean, like you said, the evidence now, because where we really are going to go from here is, I'm going to ask, like, well, what about other drugs? Things like Vicodin, or even if I want to go get heroin today and I'm like, you know what, fuck this, I'm going to get some heroin. Where should I go to get that? would it be helpful if we even started moving towards somewhere, a place where people can say, I'm going to get heroin today, and the place you go to get heroin is a therapist office up the road with a doctor, a clinician, a group meeting, people hanging out who are successful drug users or recovered drug users, and a dentist. I mean, all the things that you would need. And hey, you've just taken somebody who is at a place where they're like, fuck it, I need heroin. And you've dumped them into a pit of helpful services that they might or might not use. But is that something you've even considered?
I haven't considered in a lot of depth. It's a hugely important question in addiction treatment and recovery. And there are countries that are providing prescription heroin or prescription diacetylmorphine. My overall consideration and the types of problems and questions that I tend to be interested in are thinking across systems and at the societal level. And a concern that I've had is any given policy in isolation is necessarily incomplete. Like our policy responses are never going to be just one little lever we can pull. They always exist in conversation with the broader cultural approach to addiction and drug issues. And so, for example, people talk a lot about decriminalization. Mm-hmm. And for starters, decriminalization is a messy word. It can mean a lot of different things. Yeah. It's not even necessarily clear what decriminalization means. But in the world of sound bites, a lot of times we get into a debate about whether decriminalization is quote unquote good or bad. But in reality, countries that have successfully enacted things like decriminalization, like Portugal, have done that as part of a huge suite of other services and approaches that don't just exist at the technocratic level. It's not even about housing and vocational services and protections and income. It's also about the rhetorical and the cultural attitudes toward addiction, because a lot of times the decriminalization and these measures outside of the United States are the least important thing of what's actually happening. The legal change in terms of the criminal penalties attached to possession of a small quantity of drugs for personal use is the least important thing in a lot of these cases. Yeah. And I think you could make the same type of argument about prescription heroin, that, maybe it's worth considering. I don't know. But like, I would be concerned about focusing in too much on just one policy lever. Like when what we really need is a change in consciousness. What we really need, this goes along with what I was saying before, is like, if we know things that will save lives, why aren't we doing those things? The bottom line bedrock thing that I think needs to change is people's fundamental attitudes toward problems of addiction and drug use problems, which are not even the same thing. They're two totally separate things.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's said it better than I could have come up to answer that question. The world where you would be able to, if you were desperate enough to get heroin, would have to be a world where people's hearts were like, there's a person in my community who is so desperate they're, taking a risk or something. Who can I put them in contact with? So, which again leads to our final question. How would you define recovery, or how do you define recovery?
I haven't boiled it down to some cute sentence necessarily, but I like the notion of any positive change. Which is also a common phrase in the harm reduction community. And the way that I would qualify, and I talk about it at some length in the closing part of my book, but I would qualify it by saying it's not just any positive change, because not everybody identifies with the identity of recovery. So I do think there's an element where it also has to be self-chosen. Not everybody who has successfully resolved a drug or alcohol problem identifies as being in recovery. Sometimes it's useful to engage them on that issue, even just like clinically or psychotherapeutically, to say like, do you think you might be in recovery, or what does it mean to be in recovery or not in recovery? But I would never impose that on, say, a patient of mine. I would never say, you should call yourself as a person in recovery. Maybe they just think to themselves, I had a problem with drinking and now I stopped it. Who cares?
I like that.
I think when people start gatekeeping about what recovery is or isn't, that to me feels a little unhelpful. And part of it is the challenge of, and I've talked to, for example, John Kelly, who runs the Recovery Research Institute at Harvard, about this. There is a problem in research and clinical care where you do need to operationalize things. You do need a definition. If you're going to study the phenomenon, you need to be able to define and classify the phenomenon. But then that's different than saying in everyday common language, I'm in recovery. Okay, what does that mean to you? So I think it's like addiction. It's one of these prismatic terms where coming at it from different directions, it might have different meanings.
And I'm hearing like that might be a term that it might go away as we move into a holistic model, because nobody, I don't think, says I'm in recovery from OCD or I'm in recovery from depression. It's more of a mindset of saying I'm going to slowly but surely try to work through it a little better today or try a different tool at my disposal. And recovery doesn't really fit that. I've been looking at it for the longest like a club people really want to be in that they're not allowed to.
Well, there are people in mental health recovery. There is a recovery movement for general mental health. So I think there are probably people with OCD who say I'm in recovery from OCD. It's actually very common in eating disorders where people talk about it in terms of recovery. I like finding the commonalities, and I like a big tent approach where, again, we're not gatekeeping, where people are looking for the shared strengths and the shared lessons rather than what divides us. I'm in abstinence-based recovery myself, but there are people out there who say I'm in partial recovery or that I'm in non-abstinent recovery. And who the hell am I to say no? Who am I to say that doesn't count as recovery? That's not the way I want to be living today.
That's fair. I don't want the stress either. I've noticed like being like, that's fine, whatever. Did you keep the prongs? The taser prongs?
Oh yeah, I've got them. They're in storage, but yeah, they're around.
It's so funny the things we keep from our like the cultural artifacts or the life artifacts. So anything you want to add before we get out of here?
No, nothing particular, Ben. I really appreciate the chance to meet and to talk. I think it's great to just get different stories. And, I'm a fan of the nerdier, more academic approaches to addiction and drug use. So it's great. It's great to meet and make the connection. Yeah. The only other thing I would add, I guess, maybe more for the outro than anything else, is to send people to my website, because that way I can actually connect with them.
Cool. Yeah. I'll link that in the episode description. Is it Dr. Carl Erik Fisher? The website is carlerikfisher.com. Erik with a K. But again, it'll be linked in the episode description if you want. So appreciate your time, man. This has been a blast. Hopefully we'll talk again in the future. That was Dr. Carl Fisher, and his info is all linked in the episode description. His book, The Urge, is a terrific, easy-to-read journey through the history of addiction and the patterns of bad treatment that have followed every drug epidemic in the world. It's well worth the read. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce. My publicist is like, you're interviewing somebody who released a book about the same thing you wrote about the same year as your book. Hated it. But I'm like, yeah, but it's in a lot of ways, it's a different approach. If you've already bought my book, buy this book. If you haven't bought my book, that's fine. Buy this one first.
Yeah, buy them both.
Or buy them both.